Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum students. Welcome to our class. I'm your instructor Adil Raza, and today we have to discuss an SLO from grade 6 and it's our unit 10, and today we have to discuss an SLO from the competency of reading. So let's find out what our today's SLO is and what we have to learn in this SLO. So here the SLO is associated with the reading and critical thinking. It's our lecture 4C, and the main topic of this SLO is revolves around the speaker of a story, or we can say that the narrative perspective of a story. So what the SLO is? The SLO states that identify the speaker of the poem or story, first person, third person. So let's go further. I hope you guys have understand what our today's SLO is, and in this SLO we have to learn about how to identify or determine the narrative, the narration of the story or a poem, or who is the narrator of the story or a poem. So let's find out. Here is the vertical linkage. I hope you guys have got it. Let's go further. Here we have a brainstorming activity. So let's read what the brainstorming prompt is. Who is telling the story or poem? Is that I, me, or he, she, or they? So when you read a story, you definitely look at that this most of the time the story is started with I or he, like we can say that he's doing this, yeah, he's doing that, she's going there and she going to the hillside, something like that. Or someone in some stories we have read that I am going to a hill station and there we will take our layer time, or such type of words. So when something starts with I, it means that something is narrated with the first person perspective, and when something is narrated, some story is narrated with the he, she, or it means that the narrator is not the participant of the story. The narrator is telling about someone who do some action or who have do something. So that's why we can say that when such type of words are used is the third person perspective. So I hope you guys have understand how what are the narrative perspectives and how these narrative perspectives are found in these stories. So let's read in detail what is the narrative perspective and what are different narrative perspective, and then we will try to find out the narrative perspective of our text of this lesson. So what is the narrative perspective? Narrative perspective, also known as point of view, is the vantage point of position from which a story is told. So actually the narrative perspective is the standpoint from which a story is presented or narrated. Like I have to tell a story about someone, like he is going to there and then he take a, we can say that he take a chairlift wheel. So such type of things is actually, such type of narration is considered as the third person narrative, because I'm not the participant of the action and I'm telling about some action which is not done by me, done by some other, and I have to tell the story of that one. Like in the thirsty crow, once there was a crow, he was very thirsty, or something like that. So in that story we are not the part of the story, we are telling the story of a crow who done something or some event happens to him. So that's why it's the third person narrative. And when we are being the part of the story, when we narrate a story, like we experience that action, we have done that action, so then it will be the first person narrative. So narrative perspective is actually the standpoint from which a story is narrated. So I hope you guys have understand what is a narrative perspective. So let's find out. Let's read what is the first person narrative, what is the second person narrative, and how we can narrate story from the third person perspective. So what is first person perspective? In the first person perspective, the narrator is a character within the story and use first person pronouns like I, me, my, and we. So when the first person narration is there, the first person narration is there when the character of the story itself telling about the story, and what is the indication through which we can identify that it is the first person. the character, the narrator use I, me, my or we, such type of pronouns, because what he will say, I am this and that and I have to go to see a cricket match or something like that. So that's why when he use I and he is the participant of the story, then the perspective is first person. Like, because narrators share their own thoughts, feeling and experience directly with the reader, that's why we called it the first person perspective. The person who has experienced the action is actually telling the action. Like here we have the example, I walked down the street feeling the cold wind and my face on my face. So because he used I and he tells about his own experience, that's why it's the first person perspective, because he is the experiencer of the action, he is the experiencer of an happening. This is how the first person narrative works, or this is how we can narrate the stories or actions in a first person way. So let's find out what is second person perspective. What it is, second person perspective addresses the reader directly using the pronoun you. So in this perspective, you are being the part of the story and you are addressing to some other character, and you are telling most of the time the action of that person which is with you or who is with you. Like we have the example, you walk down the street feeling the cold wind on your face. So you are telling with to the second person which is with you, and you are telling the experience of that person, and what you have said, you have used the pronoun of you. So this is how we can identify the second person perspective, because in the second person perspective, the participant or the storyteller is being the part of the story, but he presents the experiences and the emotions of the other character of the story. So this is how the second person narration is formed, and we can identify second person of narration through identification of these things. So let's find out. Here we have the third person perspective. What is the third person perspective? In third person perspective, the narrator is outside the story, he is not the part of the story, and refers to the characters by their names or third person pronouns. And what are the third person pronouns? Like he, she, they, it. So in this perspective, the narrator is not the part of the story, and he tells the story of someone. Like we have read the story of a greedy dog, or we have the story of the fox and the grapes, we have read the story of the thirsty crow. So in all these story, what is the common? The third person perspective, because no one of them is being the part of the story, but we can tell those stories through using third person pronouns or the names of the characters. So this is how the third person perspective form, and you can identify. Like the same line is said with the third person perspective, how it will be: she walked down the street feeling the cold wind on her face. Because he used her, she, these are the third person pronouns, that's why the narrative perspective of this line or this story becomes the third person perspective. So I hope you guys have understand what is a third person perspective and how to identify third person's perspective. Let's go further. Here we have the text, so let's read the text and try to find out what is the perspective of the text. It was bedtime, and the children were all ears, waiting for their grandfather to start his story every night before going to bed. Their grandfather told them interesting stories. All of them were very fond of these stories. The children gathered around their grandfather, ready to hear one of his story, but instead of starting the story, their grandfather asked them a question: who switched all the lights off in the drawing room? So students, we have to indicate the perspective of this text. So firstly, there is a third person pronoun, and what is that third person pronoun? The third person pronoun is it. So it indicates that this story is actually narrated in the third person perspective. Like we have the pronoun there, we have are there as well, and we have the grandpa's talk in the inverted commas, which indicates that someone outside the action, someone outside the story is actually telling about the event or the happening of somewhere. That's why we can say that the narrative perspective of this text is third person narrative, because there the third person pronouns are used and no one of the main character is actually telling the story. So I hope you guys have understand how to identify the narrative perspectives and what the narrative perspectives are. So use your knowledge about the narrative perspective, use your understanding of the narrative perspectives, and try to identify the narrative perspective of this article as your classroom activity. Let's go further. Here is the simulation. It is also based on the narrative perspectives and it will enlarge your understanding of the narrative perspective. The link is in the description box. You can also watch it. Here we have a worksheet. Kindly pause this video and according to the knowledge of this SLO, attempt this worksheet. Let's find out what next. We have a homework. Here there is a short story. What you have to do, you have to read this short story and try to identify the narrative perspective of this short story according to the understanding which you have gone through this lecture. Let's find out. Here is a resource pack. The resource pack will help you to achieve the SLO in a compact way, in a better way. If you find any issue regarding the narrative perspective, different types of narrative perspective, what are the different pronouns, what are the different ways to address the characters in different perspectives, if you find any issue, any, we can say that the confusion, you can ask in the comment section or ask from your teacher as well. I hope you guys have understand. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.